ultimately a human being has to be accountable in order for an organization to act responsibly, because someone has to be accountable if they aren't. Where those kinds of approaches go wrong is when the rest of the organization thinks because it's that person's accountability, it's their sole responsibility to make sure it happens. And that's where you get the privacy officers off in the corner, and all they are is on the hook if there's a privacy, if there's an exploit and things get revealed, but then the organization doesn't change its behavior. So at the layer below that, there's professional ethics.
Hey everyone, I'm Debbie Madden, the host of the Scaling Tech podcast. And today I have the honor of talking with my good friend, Ken Judy. Hey Ken, how are you?
Good. How you doing, Debbie?
Many of you who listen to this podcast know that Ken and I have known each other for decades. We work together at Stride. We're talking about a topic that is very near and dear to Ken's heart and also mine, ethical considerations in AI. Before we jump in, for those that don't know Ken, he's currently a partner at Stride, where he does many things, among them coaching tech leaders, and serves as an advisor and a leader on many custom software projects, focusing on building collaborative team-based organizations and the responsible use of generative AI, which we're going to dig into now, to address meaningful business challenges. And Ken has over 30 years in tech, 15 years of those in executive leadership roles. So Ken and I have talked about this topic over the years outside of AI when we were talking about software development. So I'm really excited to jump in with you, Ken, here. I'm going to start with a big question, and you can answer it, however you wish. But people say ethics in AI, and like many things, it could be lip service or it could be real, right? So what are the ethical principles that you think should guide the development of AI? There are many. Talk about the ones that you think are kind of table stakes, and answer that however you wish.
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's about taking accountability as someone who uses the tools for the impact your use of those tools has, to the degree that you can do anything about it, right? So it's not to the extreme that because there are potential drawbacks in using the tools, we're not going to use them at all. That just isn't an option. So how can we use them so the net effect of our using them is positive as best as we can control that? And that falls on many dimensions, one of which is the impact it has on people. And in the case of what we do, which is around building these custom workflows for very talented people in organizations who are trying to solve very important problems, it's about making their jobs better, not replacing them, right? So fundamentally, our goal is, how can we take someone who, if you ask them the question, what's the essential thing you can do that no one else can do in this company? How can we make it so they're doing as much of that as possible and as little of everything else? And even within the task of, say, writing code, there's tons of things that people do that aren't essential to the value they're creating or the joy they take from the work. And those things we can help them try to automate. And much of that automation doesn't necessarily need generative AI, and some of it does. And that's another piece, is use it responsibly, use it for what it actually can contribute value to and not for anything else, so that you're not wasting, this very expensive, very resource intensive tool doing things that other things can do better. And then once you identify those things, try to make sure that you understand how what you're doing with that will not create unintended harm. So make sure that you're not stealing intellectual property as best as you can. And there's both legal protections for that, and then there's emerging movements to try to actually do that substantially. So the best we have right now is kind of making sure that legal protections are in place, that you're indemnified, that you're doing what you can to use these frontier models in ways they don't, take other people's content and represent them. But that's the best we got right now. It will get better. There are movements to, ethically source the content upon which these models are trained, to open source the models, things like that, where there's going to be more transparency and creators will be better protected in terms of what these models are pulling together as patterns to give answers. Um, so things like that.
Yeah, like like with many emerging and fast moving things, right? The ethical behavior is to follow the principles ahead of the required regulations.
As best you can and as best as you know them, right? So there's a burden to understand and learn. Don't use the tools carelessly, but you won't have perfect insight into how to use them because they're changing all the time, and it's a constantly evolving. And then fundamentally, for both the people we're building this for and for ourselves, the fact that we have these generative AI large models that are doing really things close to reasoning doesn't excuse us of any of our responsibility for what we create. So when we're creating a tool for someone, what that tool does is our responsibility. When someone is using that tool, what they then do with the artifacts that are created by that is their responsibility. So none of this excuses anybody from something happening because they weren't paying enough attention to it. As long as you think that way, you put the extra time in to make sure you're doing it well.
Right. And the way I kind of view being responsible in AI is, it's the basic stuff like, two wrongs don't make a right, right? Like if most people, majority of people approach sourcing data, using data, and reviewing data that are created by these various models and tools from an ethical perspective, then together collectively we will be ethical, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a fool's errand to think that no one could be ethical unless everyone's ethical, right? I mean that
Yeah,
just
that's
is
an impossibility, right?
right. There's
Yeah.
no way that's going to happen. So in lieu of that, if we as individuals can, I love how you have said several times in a few short minutes, like to the best of your ability, to the best of your knowledge, right? Like again, that's just, oh, because I didn't know 100% of everything, I'm going to wave my arms. I'm just going to not care. No, no, no. Right?
Right.
Right?
Right.
Like that's not getting us anywhere. And so I want to go into the topic of transparency for a second, because you and I have been agilists for most of our careers, and transparent work and visible work is a tenet of agile, and I think it's a tenet of generative AI as well. And so how like what is the thinking in terms of how do we make our work transparent and visible so that we can have multiple eyeballs on the facts and not leave it to interpretation? Like are there best practices in transparency emerging that you're aware of?
Well, there's a bit of opacity, right? Like you're using these complicated models and the answers you get are not going to be consistent. So in the small team that I'm working in, we're trying to address problems at scale. So for us, consistency is very important, and it's what the people who are paying us to do this need. And so we put a lot of time and energy into, given the range of choices we have, picking the right model. So sometimes that's not, we don't get to select from among many models, we get to select from within a given set of models that are provided by what we're allowed to work with for a client. Once you've selected the model, we work really hard to get the right answer the first time. So there are these different patterns. You can have a multi-agent agentic approach. You can have what's called a single shot, where you try to get it perfect the first time. Our philosophy is that agentic approaches or multi-prompt approaches don't excuse you from putting the time and work in to get the first prompt as good as you can. So there's there are two types of prompts. There's the prompts that basically set up the persona that the agent is pretending to be, and it's just pretending to be it. And then there's the prompt that's asking it to do a thing. And you can work with both of those to get the best possible answer to the question that you're trying to give them. And that also involves giving them the right context, which means what's necessary for it to give the right answer, and as best as you can, no more or no less.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a real process of trying to figure this out. And that is an iterative process that in a way creates many of these LLM completion requests. So it's expensive, but the output of that is a consistent answer that is closer to what people need more of the time, which reduces then the amount of time you need to spend when they're actually using it, going back and forth with the model. Now, that doesn't mean you don't use multiple prompts, either within a same threaded discussion or with different personas. That depends on what you specifically need. But it's like any kind of engineering. You use the tool or pattern or approach to solve a specific problem, not because you're lazy.
Right.
And that's very aggressive of me, but there's some of the hype around the magic of this stuff is an excuse not to think deeply about how you're using it. And that is dangerous.
Yeah.
Because then you're either creating a lot of waste, which then goes into, in our case, we may be spending several hours to a day trying to design a prompt and make it as efficient as possible. But then we want the client to be able to run that prompt 1,000, 10,000, 20,000 times. So imagine if we were careless about the work we put into that. And so without needing to, we add 3, 4, 5 different additional interactions with an LLM that have to run every time that thing runs. That now you're order of magnitude exceeding the usage that you would need to do it right. And that has a huge impact.
Yeah. Okay. So here's my next curiosity. Is there a job, a role inside an organization whose sole accountability is to govern the outputs of what you just described? And if not, do you think a role will emerge or should emerge? Because good actors being ethical is obviously table stakes of this recipe, right? Ethical AI discussion we're having. And like with many things, there's often some sort of, company governance, whether formal or informal, and the governance can come in the form of policies and all that good stuff. And we talked about, things are emerging from a legal perspective, but in terms of like the accountability perspective in the company, right? Like I always see so many parallels to Agile. Like we started replacing, written documentation with outcomes and working software, but then we created a Scrum Master to be accountable for the project roadmap, right? Like, and like that took time, but like, do you think there's like a governance person or role or job accountable for all this yet? And if not, do you think there will be?
Yeah. So there are multiple layers to that question. At an organizational level, yes, there has to be someone accountable. And that will be, in the existing way things are structured, whoever is accountable for privacy or compliance, organizations have that. It can be in legal, it can be in tech. That person, ultimately, a human being has to be accountable in order for an organization to act responsibly, because someone has to be accountable if they aren't. Where those kinds of approaches go wrong is when the rest of the organization thinks because it's that person's accountability, it's their sole responsibility to make sure it happens. And that's where you get the privacy officer who's off in the corner, and all they are is on the hook if there's a privacy, if there's an exploit and things get revealed, but then the organization doesn't change its behavior. So at the layer below that, there's professional ethics, and each individual who interacts with this stuff has to be a professional and hold themselves professionally accountable for ethical use of these things, for understanding. And in Agile, since we're talking about Agile, there's this concept of we have experts, but we don't have specialists, right? So you have people in the organization who have the time to learn this stuff better than other people, but that doesn't excuse everybody else from the important work they have to do their job. They can rely on this expert for advice and guidance, but it's not where they do it in complete ignorance of this thing and then hand it off to the specialist to do it.
Yeah.
And that's the concept behind privacy by design, and how all of these issues are kind of the thought about how to actually make them real and living in your organization are evolving.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like I was talking to someone else at Stride last week about how Gen AI is enabling certain organizations to leapfrog Agile. There was a QA team we were talking to, and they weren't Agile, but now they could use Gen AI and just kind of be, like bring Gen AI to their testing efforts. And I think, my hope is that Agile will prevail, even on the companies that do leapfrog it, because not every organization is high functioning Agile or Agile at all. But I feel like a lot of the tenets from Agile, if not carried along, could kind of set the tech world back a little,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
This whole idea of like not one human being is responsible and everyone wipes their hands of things. Like I feel like if we carry through these tenets of Agile, and we force ourselves to tether these tenets of Agile to the way we build software now with these new tools, then we have a chance of doing things in an ethical, responsible way, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that all ties into all the the other hype about Agile being dead. Agile isn't a set of practices. It's a set of values and principles. And those values and principles are about personal responsibility, collaboration, treating people with dignity and respect, and focusing on building the things that are actually useful. And so, yeah, if introduction of different tool sets and automation is going to change the practices tremendously, but that doesn't mean that the values aren't important. And anything that honors the values and principles is therefore Agile, right?
Right. And I think like my hypothesis is that companies that already embrace an Agile value set, those voices have been around for 2 decades. They will be loud enough and pervasive enough in the org that they will carry through to the AI. But there's another set of companies that are like very new to Agile, or not even, aware of it so much yet, because these organizations may not have been technical yet. They might have been paper-based businesses that are now all of a sudden using AI, right? And so, like, who's there to teach those organizations around these values? And that's a whole nother conversation. But as you're talking about, and we're tying it in, I got myself wondering about there is a subgroup of organizations that have not been technology first organizations ever, right? Certain industries have not had to be, and now they're starting to be pulled into this AI world. And it's not that they're fighting Agile, they're just not educated yet.
Yeah. Well, there are organizations that are not technical that are values driven or informed,
Yes.
and there are many, many technical organizations that are not. So
Right.
I think that if you care about people, you treat people with respect, and you moderate the imperatives of capitalism along with valuing things that are not the short-term returns of business decisions, then you stand a chance, if you embrace those things and hold on to those things, of introducing these technologies well. And that comes from leadership, and then leadership enabling and allowing people in the organization who get and care about those things to do their jobs and still get and care about those things. And if that's the case, if you care about people and you respect the people you work with, your first instinct is not going to be how many of these people can I replace? It'll be, how can I help these people get their jobs done better? And that's the right attitude to take with a tool that is not a human being. It is something that helps people do their jobs.
I agree 100%. So I appreciate that. And I know we've kind of dove into ethics in AI and then, brought in Agile, I really think that's the right way to think about ethics in AI is like, we're not starting, like we didn't all just because we're using new tools doesn't mean we can't bring the best of what we've learned over decades of working. So I feel like the conversation like really benefits from being linked, right, to each other, taking the best of what we know so far and adding on the new. So is there anything, we're right almost out of time. Um for folks listening, a lot of folks listening to the podcast are either technologists or technology leaders, software engineering, product, and my guess is generally wanting to be ethical about AI. And so is there anything like that you can think of, um any kind of, if you're going to do one thing, do this, right? Is there any kind of like, with I liken it to like healthcare. It's like, all right, if you're not going to get enough sleep every night, everything else is going to be harder. Right, like, you can eat healthy and exercise, but if you're not going to get enough sleep, then everything else is going to be harder. Is there anything on the ethical AI side, like, okay, if you're not going to do this basic thing, everything else is going to be harder?
I think it's about really reckoning with yourself and figuring out what you care about and what you stand for, and then figuring out how to do your job so that you honor those things and be honest about it. If you don't, what you care about is what you care about. What you don't care about, you don't care about. You're not going to, when things get hard, you're not going to defend a thing you don't care about.
Mhm.
And, you know, every one of these things is going to put you in situations where you have to make tough choices. So it better be things you care about. So understand that. Do you care about the welfare of the people you work with, or the human value of the things you create? Do you care about craft? Do you care about sustained long-term wealth creation as opposed to short-term profits? Or do not? It's, I mean, there's no way an unethical person is going to become an ethical person if they don't care. But the path to becoming ethical is actually being honest about what you care about and finding a way to pursue that in a way that's consistent. I have to believe that at the end of the day, enough people are not here to hurt other people. That's not something they wake up each day wanting to do. So find a way to do your job so that you don't do that, in the ways that you care about. And that'll be better than pretending you're something you're not.
Yeah. And I love that answer. And that's why I asked the question, because we talk a lot a bit about all the different, paths that we can go down and the complexities, but it really comes down, end of the day, the core is often the most simplistic yet foundational. If you ignore the core and try to pretend, there's only so long you can pretend. So actually care, be honest with yourself about things you care about, start there. Everything
Mm-hmm.
else will be easier,
Yep.
right?
Then
So,
you apply your professionalism in your craft to understand the details of what you're doing and how it lines up to what you care about.
yep, yep. I love that. Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad we were able to talk about the last question because I think it's so important. I appreciate you coming on. This is great.
Sure.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. Bye.